Night Shift Whispers.
A shocking news came and disrupted my day that had been so stable and good for so long. My father suddenly passed away, even though he had no history of serious illness. I had to take a long leave of absence from my job to go back to my hometown, hold a funeral and take care of the things my father left behind, including his business. Apart from me, there was no one else who could do that, because I was the only family member my father had left. My biological mother died when I was still a child, and my stepmother died a year ago. From 2 marriages, I am his only descendant. Because of the worry that I would have difficulty facing all of that matters alone, my girlfriend came along with me to help me, or at least accompany me facing through my mourning days. But apparently there was nothing to worry about, since many of my father's colleagues came to help. Even Mr. Benson, the former driver who had worked for my family for over a decade, came to me when I was alone in my father's room, telling me that he would try to help me as much as he could until I was done with all the affairs here. Because everything was fine, my girlfriend left me on the 2nd day. After all, she couldn't leave her job for too long. So I assured her that I could handle everything without her. The first 2 days, the sadness was not too noticeable, as there were still many guests coming and going. I thought the next day would be the start of the loneliness, but because I was exhausted, I fell asleep early in the afternoon and didn't have time to overthink at night. The next day, the 3rd day since my father died, I woke up because I heard the sound of activity in the kitchen. As I remembered, before I went to bed, I had locked all the doors, windows, and the gate as well. So, who could have entered my kitchen without my help? Curious, I rushed to the kitchen. A middle-aged woman was washing dishes there. She was someone I knew, Mrs. Martha, our former maid. "Oh, ma'am, you're here? When did you come?" I asked her in confusion. She turned and smiled. "Just now ago," she replied. "But the door was locked. Do you have a duplicate key?" Again, the woman smiled. Instead of answering, she offered to make me food. Hearing the word food, I immediately realized that I was starving. I quickly said yes and went to get her money to go shopping. But apparently, there were still plenty of fresh ingredients in the fridge. Mrs. Martha quickly cooked my favorite food without having to go shopping first. That morning, I had breakfast with Mrs. Martha and Mr. Jason, our former gardener, who also happened to be at my house. Strangely, they didn't eat. They just stood next to the dining table, accompanying me while we talked. Mrs. Martha and Mr. Jason stayed with me all day at home and prepared everything I needed, until at night I sent them off to the gate. Then I locked the gate and the door of my house. The next day, I woke up to the same sound again. The sound of activity from the kitchen. When I rushed over, there was another woman tidying up the room. This time it wasn't Mrs. Martha, but Mrs. Ellie, who was also a former maid at our house. Curious, I tried looking out into the yard, and sure enough, a former gardener was also watering the plants there, This time I was very sure that I had locked the door and gate last night after sending Mrs. Martha and Mr. Jason off. Is it possible that every former worker of my family must have a duplicate key to our house? Or could it be that Mr. Benson helped them to come and go from our house? It's no secret that Mr. Benson had been my father's trusted man for many years. That day I intended to go out for some business, but the two people who were assigned to accompany me for the time being suggested me to stay at home for a week, not to go anywhere yet since I was in mourning. Besides, I still looked tired. Okay, I did still want to be lazy. Not only was I tired from taking care of the funeral, but to be honest, I had been really in need of a vacation since a few months before. I was too stressed due to the never-ending work. The next day and the day after that went by in a similar fashion. Every time I woke up in the morning, a former maid would be busy in the kitchen and a former gardener would be watering the plants in the yard. And it was still the same. They would prepare everything I needed, but they would never have meal with me, only talk. They also advised me to stay in the house until we complete a full week of mourning. On the 6th day, I tried to check the fridge, thinking it was time to go shopping. They cooked every day, so surely some of the ingredients would have run out and needed to be restocked. But strangely, the fridge was still full as ever. Did they come here every day with groceries? Why didn't they ever give me the bill? That night, I felt unwell. I had a fever, a headache, and stomachache, and I felt completely drained. I tried to sleep, but I was haunted by the same dream over and over again. My father appeared in my dream and kept apologizing. What was going on? Was it just a side effect of my fever, or was something really wrong? My pain worsened as the morning approached. I tried to find the other former maid who was usually in the kitchen every morning. I had to ask her for help, but my body collapsed near the bed. I couldn't walk. I shouted and shouted for the maid, but my voice didn't come out. It took me a very long time to crawl slowly until I finally arrived in the kitchen and found the figure I was looking for. The former maid turned to me, but she didn't care. Her expression was so cold. She served breakfast on the table and told me to eat without helping me stand up at all. "Ma'am, please, ma'am, I'm sick. I have to go to the doctor," I begged in a hoarse voice that was barely audible. She stood still, just standing there and looking at me with a cold stare. After a few moments, all of the former maids and gardeners who had been alternating to accompany me for a week began to arrive. They stood around me, but no one wanted to help. They just looked at me, and slowly I realized their gazes seemed to imply a sense of satisfaction, accompanied by a cold smirk that I had never seen on their faces before. What was really going on? Why was it like this? "Sir, ma'am, help me," I continued to beg. They remained silent. I didn't know how long I spent in pain and moaning for help, but I was ignored by them. My consciousness came and went. In a state of confusion, fear, and despair, a voice inside me told me to run away from this house as soon as possible. Something was wrong and I had to run away no matter what. I struggled to crawl out in a way that was difficult to describe. I don't know how long it took. From my consciousness coming and going, it is not impossible that I fainted several times in my attempt to get out of the house. When I finally arrived in the yard, it was dark outside and it was raining heavily. Lightning flashed incessantly. Outside the gate of the yard, a woman in her 60s was frantically calling out to me. She was trying to break down the locked gate while looking around for help from around her. She told me to hurry up and throw the key out. I tried hard, but I couldn't do it anymore. Along with the sound of a thunderclap, I was no longer able to remember anything else anymore. When I finally woke up, I was already in the hospital ward. The woman in her 60s, who turned out to be Mrs. Stefan, my neighbor, was still next to me, taking care of me, looking like she was sighing heavily repeatedly. She told me not to think about anything for now until my condition improved. It took me more than 3 days to recover. Strangely, the doctor scolded me with the accusation that I had been negligent for not eating at all for a week. He said that I was sick because of malnutrition. My stomach was empty. It hadn't been filled for a full week. How could this happen? I was sure I had been having meal 3 times a day, never late even once. After I was allowed to go home, Mrs. Stefan forbade me to go home to my own house. She told me to stay at her house for the time being. She said that she was suspicious because she had never seen me go out of the house for days. Her gut feeling told her that something was wrong, but she couldn't check it herself because the doors, windows, and the gate of my yard were always locked. When I told her about my father's former workers who continued to take care of me for a week, he sighed even more heavily. From her, I finally found out that all the former workers had died. Everyone who worked in our house eventually died in some way. Some got suddenly ill, some had traffic accidents, some fell down the stairs, and some committed suicide. The last person who died was Mr. Benson, 3 months ago, being hit by a falling tree on his way home. That's why in the end my father didn't hire anyone anymore. He spent his last 3 months alone without an assistant or driver. People said that my father had sold his soul to the devil to make his business successful. Instead, he must make offerings to the devil, the souls of the people around him. And if I look back, he tended to advise me to pursue an education and a career in a distant city, almost always making excuses so that I would never go home. It is possible that, because he could no longer bear the guilt and sadness of continuing to watch the people closest to him leave, my father finally gave up his soul. My neighbors forbade me to live in that cursed house any longer. In my father's will, it was also written that he donated our house to a social foundation. But before leaving, I still have to pick up the things I left behind. Several neighbors accompanied me into the house. They were still there, the figures that resembled our former maids and house gardeners, but only I could see them. Whether their souls were actually trapped in there or whether it was just a disguise from the devil that my father worshipped, I no longer wanted to know. I quickly packed up my things and left my house without any further hesitation. Last time, when I locked the gate from the outside, I saw them standing in the yard and looking at me with disappointed eyes. My memory echoed the repeated apologies my father said in my dream the other day. "Forgive me, son. Please forgive your father."